Iron, nickel, and cobalt are the three metals that have the highest relative permeability or magnetic susceptibility. So they all make for outstanding materials for the core about which you can wind wire to make an electromagnet. So I say that because here you see two electromagnets, and they both have iron selected as their core. So coil number one, in red, it has a voltage source, and we can see the positive and the negative terminal, although at this instant we see switch A is open. On coil number two, there is no power source, but there is a resistor that represents the resistance of a light bulb. Now I don't imagine that light bulb should be glowing if switch A is in the open position. But imagine what happens in the brief instant when switch A is momentarily closed. All right, well, let's figure out which way current flows. So when we close the switch, current is going to flow from negative to positive within the battery, then external to the battery through the circuit. Current will flow from positive toward negative, which means it's going to go up behind and then down in front, and then it wraps around and goes up behind again and then down in front, and so on until ultimately it comes around and completes the loop. So if you use the right-hand rule, you could figure out which way magnetic field lines are going to point through this solenoid. Have you got it? Yeah, hopefully you've got this right. The magnetic field lines will point in this direction, and they'll be nearly uniform within the solenoid. Outside the solenoid, they stray a little bit, but then again, the high relative permeability of this piece of iron magnetizes that iron. It causes the magnetic dipole moments to align, and so actually the magnetic field lines continue on, and then they get passed through this coil, and so what you have is a sudden increase in the magnetic flux through coil number two during the instant during which this switch is closed, right? So the magnetic flux went from zero, right? Initially it went from zero, and then it goes up to some value due to these magnetic field lines that point to the right. So a change in flux always induces voltage and causes currents to flow. So somehow the signal from this battery, without any electrical connection at all, could make currents flow through the light bulb. So in which direction is that current going to flow? Okay, let's go through that one more time and see if you can apply Lenz's law to figure out the direction that current will flow in the light bulb as the switch is closed. So once again, we know when the switch is closed that it's going to make current flow this way through coil number one. That makes magnetism suddenly appear where there was none before, pointing in this direction. Those magnetic field lines continue and then represent a change in flux from zero up to some other value. By the way, if we want to label this first magnet, we can then say this end is like the north, and this end is like the south pole. The coil number one itself becomes an electromagnet in the form of a dipole magnetic field. So the induced currents are going to flow in circuit number two in such a way as to try to oppose the increase that generates the currents in the first place. So the second coil wants to behave like a magnet whose magnetic field points this way to oppose the change in flux that made that current in the first place. So using the right-hand rule, the only way you could get your thumb to point in this direction is if current were flowing upward in this part of the wire, then down and back, and then upward and upward, right? Doesn't that show that you'd make magnetic field pointing back to the left to oppose the external magnetic field? So if current's flowing up and then down this way, then that means current goes up, down, and then continues around like this. So current would flow to the left through the light bulb in the instant that this switch is closed. Now what if the switch stays closed for a while? So case number one, close switch A. What was the result? current flowing this way through the resistor. Case number 2, leave switch A closed. Well, if you leave it closed, then there's not going to be any change. And the whole idea behind Faraday's law and Lenz's law has to do with change. So the switch A is closed, current then flows this way, up and back, down and front. Magnetic field lines are produced that continue through the second coil. But if that switch stays closed for a while, this second coil kind of gets used to having a magnetic flux pointing to the right. And if that's steady, and there's no more change in that magnetic flux, then there's zero induced current in the second circuit. So when the switch is left closed, that means the current is zero. Okay, so what do you think step 3 is all about? Right, in step 3 we're going to imagine what happens when we open switch A back up. So these field lines are here, they've been steady for a while, and all of a sudden somebody comes along and opens this switch. So what happens? Well, this current disappears. And if the current disappears, these magnetic field lines disappear. And if they disappear in coil 1, they're no longer pushed through coil number 2. So what happened is we went from having a steady flux to now all of a sudden the flux disappears. Well, nature hates any change in flux. So if the coil had kind of got used to having magnetic flux pointing to the right, and all of a sudden those field lines are taken away, then an induced current shows up that tries to bring magnetic field lines back to the right to restore the field that had become steady for a while. So the only way we can get magnetic field to the right, well, let's try to figure that out based on our right-hand rule. And I think you see it. Current would have to flow upwards, that it goes up and back, and then down in front, down in front, down in front. And then doesn't that agree based on the right-hand rule that there'd be an induced magnetic field flowing this way? And so that means the induced current is flowing to the right through our resistor. And then if you leave switch open for a while, all of a sudden the second coil finally gets used to the fact that there's no longer an external magnetic field. And so if there's no longer any change that's taking place, then that induced magnetic field goes away and the induced current comes back to zero again. So you only have an induced current through the light bulb in the moments that the switch is either opened or closed. But whenever anything stays steady, then there's no current. So the light bulb would flicker as the switch is continuously opened and closed. An alternative version would be to get rid of the battery and replace it with a generator. With a generator, you'd produce AC current through the primary coil. And so if the current went for a moment in that direction, then reversed back this direction and so on, there'd be magnetic field pointing to the left and then back to the right and to the left and to the right and so on. And that would create a continuously changing flux through the second coil, and the light bulb would then continuously glow.